Hi, and welcome to Capturing Christianity. My name is Cameron Bertuzzi. I'm here with Dr. William Lane Craig. Let me go ahead and pull him in here really quickly. So he's here, and we're talking about all of the books that he's written over the years, and there's quite a list. Actually, let me go ahead and pull up the photo that you sent over just a little bit earlier, right before we started this. How many books are actually in this photo right here?
Probably over 40, I think.
40. Wow. Yeah, on your website it says 30 plus, but now you're at 40, and you've just finished. You've just finished your book. You were telling me right before we went live, you just finished your book on the historical atom, and so now you're turning to work on your systematic theology book. What do you anticipate the length of that one being?
Oh, I suppose it'll be a multi-volume work, because what I want to try to do is to summarize my life's work in this systematic philosophical theology. So the books that you and I will talk about today would all be summarized in the course of this book.
Well, if you don't know who Dr. William Lane Craig is, he has 2 PhDs. He's got a PhD in philosophy and a PhD in, is it just history or the evidence for the resurrection? What would you label
theology.
Theology.
Theology, systematic theology.
He runs a website called reasonablefaith.org, and they have a lot of online materials. Their website is linked in the description of this video. And by the way, with all of the books that we'll be discussing today, I don't have any of them linked yet in the description of the video, but if you're watching this after we go live or after the live stream ends, I'm going to put a list of all of the books that Dr. Craig talks about today in a pinned comment. In the first comment that you'll see below the YouTube video will be a list of all of the books that we discussed today. So if you'd like to check one of them out personally, then that's the way that you can do it. It's going to be the easiest way to do it. With that said, let's go ahead and get started. Which book would you like to start with? Oh, let me mention this too. So this was not Dr. Craig's idea. This was not him trying to reach out to me and ask to sell his books. That was not what this is about. Actually, I had a supporter of mine of Capturing Christianity reach out and say, this is they suggested this topic as a video. Let's just run through, because Dr. Craig, I mean, you just heard 40 plus books. So it would be helpful to have a podcast, a video, something where he just sort of explains all of the different things that he's written over the years that a lot of people probably don't even know that you've done. Most people are just familiar with, for example, reasonable faith, or maybe something as deep as time and eternity, God and eternity. So they don't know that you've written so many different books. And so it would just be very beneficial for this in the years to come to cover all of these books as at least where you are right now, because you plan on writing more. But I just wanted to emphasize that this was not Dr. Craig trying to sell books. That's not what this is about at all. We hope that this blesses you and will be encouraging and also very, very informative, and that it might sort of interest you in some way to maybe pick up one of these books and start an interest in the topic of the Kalam, maybe on time, maybe on Adam and Eve, who knows? So that's what the purpose of this is. With that said, let's go ahead and get started. Which book would you like to start with?
Well, let me explain my strategy in my writing ministry. In order to get double mileage out of the work that I do, my strategy is to publish one book on a very scholarly level, a book intended for other academics, philosophers, theologians, and so forth, and then to take the same material and distill it down to the popular level for the ordinary layperson. So the first set of books that I did came out of my doctoral work in philosophy at the University of Birmingham. And that produced this book, The Cosmological Argument from Plato to Leibniz.
I have to say, I just picked this one up too, so I had to put this on screen. This is it was a great book. I was enjoying reading this. I'm in the middle of doing a debate with rationality rules, and so this was one of the books that I turned to for a good chunk of it. So
good. And then, in conjunction with that, I also wrote the Kalam Cosmological Argument, which is my defense of this particular version of the cosmological argument. Very good.
This is the updated cover, I think.
Yeah, that's right. This is the original.
But that one is way cooler. Look. That one I like a lot better.
Well, we've just celebrated the 40th anniversary of this book, and they've reissued it now with the original green and red cover on it, which is kind of neat.
Oh, nice. Well, tell me a little bit more about what went into these books, these first two that you mentioned.
I had encountered, after graduating from college, this argument for the existence of God based upon the finitude of the past, and it absolutely captivated me. The principal proponent of that argument was Stuart Hackett in his book, The Resurrection of Theism. And I wanted to find out, to settle my mind, was this really a sound argument for God's existence? And so I purposed that if I did do PhD work in philosophy, I would write my doctoral dissertation on this argument. And that's exactly what happened. We were able to go to the University of Birmingham in England, study with John Hick, and he supervised my work on the cosmological argument. And these books flowed out of that study.
Yeah, as I was reading the introduction to these books, you were saying that you didn't, well, maybe I'm misremembering. Did you write these books because there wasn't anything else sort of like this available? Is that one of the reasons why you wanted to do it?
It was because I had done this doctoral dissertation, a massive dissertation, and I wanted to make it available to the reading public, because when I went onto a university campus speaking on, say, the existence of God or Christianity, I could refer people to this book if they wanted to go any deeper as an evidential case for the reality of a personal creator of the universe. And so that was the motivating force behind the publication of the material. And to make it accessible to the average person, I put it on in the form of this little book called The Existence of God and the Beginning of the Universe. And this little book was actually the first of the three books that appeared that came out of that doctoral work in philosophy.
How many pages is that one?
It's very short. It's got big print. Let me just tell you. It's about 100 pages long.
Would you recommend that one today as something that people, for an introduction?
I wouldn't, because it's dated. You see, I wrote it in 1977, and since then, so much more water has flowed under the bridge in astrophysical cosmology. I mean, there's been the work of Stephen Hawking, the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, quantum models of the origin of the universe, inflationary cosmogony. So I've tried to keep up with that development in the field of astrophysics and cosmology. And so the more recent books would be the ones that I would recommend today, rather than this one from the late 1970s.
And we're about to get to those. Yeah, so what's the next book on your that you've got there?
Well, after studying at the University of Birmingham, I went on to the University of Munich to do my doctoral work in theology under Wolfhard Pannenberg. Pannenberg had stunned German theology by arguing for the resurrection of Jesus historically. And I wanted to work under Pannenberg, because if I could develop an historical argument for Jesus' resurrection, that would beautifully supplement this cosmological argument for the existence of God. And so we did go to Germany and wrote on the resurrection of Jesus, and a number of books flowed out of that doctoral work. The first of these was the actual dissertation itself, which is called The Historical Argument for the Resurrection of Jesus During the Deist Controversy. And this is, as it were, a history of historical apologetics for the resurrection of Jesus. Then I did my own version of a historical argument for the resurrection of Jesus in this companion volume, which is called Assessing the New Testament Evidence for the Historicity of the Resurrection of Jesus. So those two books go together. The one is the historical survey, and then the other is my own defense of the historicity of Jesus' resurrection. And then once again, I distilled it down to a popular level in this little book called The Sun Rises, S-O-N, and this is for the layperson, summarizing the evidence for Jesus' resurrection.
If we can pause on that last one, I recommend The Sun Rises to anybody that is interested in the evidence for the resurrection. It is one of my favorite books. One of the things that I love about it is that, as you mentioned, it's for the layperson, so anybody can really pick it up and get a lot out of it. But what really struck me about when I read that book was I understand now that it's the abridged version, it's the shortened version of your academic book.
Yes.
And so when I was reading it, I was just struck by how many arguments were condensed into so few pages. So I would have to pause after every page. I would have to pause and be like, man, that was a lot of material just to comprehend. So that book, The Sun Rises, is absolutely hands down one of my favorite books on the evidence for the resurrection, for the very fact that, as you said, it's the condensed version. So it's just it's great. So I highly recommend that if you're interested.
That's one that you can still read today with great profit, because unlike astrophysical cosmology, the evidence for Jesus' resurrection isn't changing much. It's still based in these same ancient sources. And so while there is progress in New Testament studies in analyzing these sources and the traditions behind them, The Sun Rises is still very much up to date.
Were there any more books that came out of that time there,
Yes.
or did you change to another topic?
As a result of my work on the resurrection, I have had the opportunity over the years to debate some of the principal New Testament scholars who are skeptical about the historical Jesus. One of these, for example, is John Dominic Crossan, and I debated him in Chicago in a debate moderated by William F. Buckley, entitled, "Will the Real Jesus Please Stand Up?" And that was then put into book form with 2 respondents picked by Crossan and 2 respondents picked by me. And this is a wonderful exchange with a prominent skeptical New Testament scholar on the resurrection of Jesus. I had the chance to do the same thing at Boston College with Gert Ludemann. Ludemann was the leading German critical scholar on Jesus' resurrection. And Paul Copan edited this book of that debate called The Resurrection of Jesus, Fact or Figment. And this again then has 2 respondents to the debate picked by Ludemann and 2 picked by me, along with our final responses. So the opportunity to debate these scholars has been a wonderful opportunity to see how these arguments hold up. I mean, it's one thing to write a book of your own where you're not challenged. It's a very different thing to co-author a debate book with respondents who are critical and see how the arguments hold up. And I've been so pleased to see how strong the case for Jesus' resurrection is in the face of these critics.
All right, where would you like to go next?
Well, after my doctoral work was over, I began to teach at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and I thought, what should I pick for my research project next? And I was interested in what philosophers call the coherence of theism. And this is basically a study of the attributes of God to try to show that the concept of God and his attributes is a coherent idea. And so the first attribute that I decided to tackle was divine omniscience, because this is extremely controversial. Many people have claimed that divine foreknowledge of the future is incompatible with human freedom. The idea is that if God knows everything that's going to happen and God cannot be mistaken, then everything is fated to occur and there is no free will. So for 7 years, I worked on that topic, and again, 3 books flowed out of that. The first was this one, The Problem of Divine Foreknowledge and Human Freedom, from Aristotle to Suarez. And I think you see the pattern here again. First, the historical survey of the problem, from Aristotle up through Suarez, a proponent of middle knowledge. And then I wrote my own defense of the compatibility of divine foreknowledge and human freedom in this book, The Problem of Divine Foreknowledge and Human Freedom, where I argue for their compatibility. Now, those are very academic, scholarly books. So I distilled that same material down to this little volume called The Only Wise God, which is for lay people. And it is just a fascinating discussion of God's foreknowledge of the future and analogies to it in things like backward causation, precognition of the future, something called Newcomb's paradox, and so forth. It is a wide-ranging study of the compatibility of divine foreknowledge and human freedom.
Is that another book that you would recommend today?
Very much so. This is a book on which I was way ahead of the curve. It was published in 1985, and that was before people like Clark Pinnock and others began to talk about the so-called openness of God. So I was way ahead of the curve on this, and I think it is a potent antidote to the so-called openness of God theology, which, for those who aren't aware of it, is a theology that denies God's knowledge of the future. Says that God gambles, he just tries to work things out as best he can with his knowledge of the past and present.
Where did you go from here?
Well, having done that work, I had the opportunity then to participate in books that were collaborative on the topic. So here's a book that was edited by James Bilby and Paul Eddy called Divine Foreknowledge, Four Views. And I participate in this book with the openness theologian Greg Boyd, David Hunt, who holds to what is called simple foreknowledge of the future, but he denies middle knowledge, and then Paul Helm, who is a Calvinist and says the way God foreknows the future is that he predetermines everything himself. And so in this book, I defend the middle knowledge option against openness theology, simple foreknowledge, and divine determinism.
That sounds really interesting. That's an area where I've only got like a superficial understanding of the problems. I mean, I've heard your lectures that you give on it in your defenders class. I don't know if you'd want to call those lectures. Maybe you would.
Yes.
But I've heard those, and anyways, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here.
Sure.
But let's get to the next book. Is this on the same topic, or we got a new topic?
New topic now. Having finished the study of divine omniscience after 7 years, I decided to tackle the attribute of divine eternity. And the key question here is God timeless? That is to say, does he transcend time altogether? Or is God everlasting throughout infinite time, omnitemporal? And this is an issue that has divided Christian theologians and philosophers right since the time of the Church Fathers up until today. And I was really troubled by this issue. I didn't know how to make sense of God's eternity. And so that was the topic I decided to take on next. And I spent 11 years, the next 11 years, working on the subject of divine eternity and God's relationship to time. And here are the books that came out of that. First, let me say that I believe that in order to settle the question of God's relationship to time, you have to decide what the nature of time itself is. So before you can even tackle the theological question, you've got to settle the philosophical question of the nature of time. And so I wrote a 2-volume set of books, the first called The Tensed Theory of Time, a Critical Examination, and then the second companion volume, The Tenseless Theory of Time, a Critical Examination. And these 2 books deal with the arguments for and against the tensed and the tenseless theory of time. And my studied view at the end of this is to say that time is tensed. That is to say that the difference between past, present, and future is not just perspectival. It is objective. It's an objective feature of reality, and that temporal becoming is real. Things really do come into being and go out of being. And on that basis, then, I argue in this book, God, Time, and Eternity, that the most plausible understanding of divine eternity is that God is timeless without creation and in time subsequent to the moment of creation.
I'm thinking about like the transition that you go from the Kalam to history, and was it like a natural, organic path to all of these different subjects?
You know, it wasn't, Cameron, but it has turned out to be that way. I've looked back on it, and I thought my whole philosophical career could be seen as a series of footnotes on the Kalam cosmological argument. Apart from the work on the resurrection, which is quite apart, being New Testament studies. But, for example, once you decide that there is a personal creator of the universe and that the series of past events had a beginning, then the question of the relationship of this creator to time just cannot be avoided. It just arises. So the work on divine eternity was a critical supplement to my Kalam cosmological argument in understanding the relationship of the creator to time. And then if temporal becoming is real, if the difference between past, present, and future is objective, then again, immediately the question of divine foreknowledge of the future arises and cannot be avoided. If the future is not real, then how can God know it? So it really is amazing how all of this coheres together so well.
It's all interconnected.
It is.
Here's one question that I have about your work on time, because you've in our previous interview on the Atonement, one of the things that you said that was really interesting, you said that your view on the tensed theory of time was one of the arguments that you're most confident about. Your belief in the A theory, the tensed view of time.
Yeah.
And so is this something that as you began your study, because most scientists, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, most scientists are B theorists. They believe in the tenseless theory of time.
That may be true. I think it's kind of an even divide.
Oh, interesting. Well, as you were going into your study, were you expecting to land on A theory or B theory? Were you biased in any way toward landing on one side?
I am what I would call a common sense philosopher. I think that if you are led to metaphysical views that are outrageous to common sense, you're probably on the wrong path. And I think, and everybody acknowledges, that the common sense view of time is that temporal becoming is real, that things really do come into being and pass away, that I don't exist as a sort of tenseless, four-dimensional object, and that the difference between past, present, and future is real, not just perspectival. So, yes, right from the beginning, I had a very deep, intuitive sense that the tense theory of time was correct, but I wanted to see what arguments could be offered in its favor, what arguments against it, and then to do the same thing for the tenseless theory of time.
I don't want to get us too off track here, but I have a follow-up question. Is there any common sense view that you've started with, whereas after you've done an inspection of the literature that you've come to change your mind about?
I don't think so. Not with respect to common sense views. I think in every case I've developed viewpoints that are in line, I believe, with common sense.
Yeah, one of the views that I'm thinking about is there's a view among some naturalist philosophers, including Rosenberg. What's his first name?
Alex
Rosenberg, how he denies that he exists.
Yeah.
And that seems like those are the type of common sense views that we're talking about.
That's
here, right?
exactly right. If you're led, like Rosenberg is, to say, I do not exist, I am not the same person who was speaking with you 1 minute ago. I have no thoughts about anything, and every sentence in my book is meaningless, including this one. You're on the wrong track, brother.
All right, let's move on to the next series of books, or do we have more in the vein of time?
This series. We haven't seen the popular level version of my work on God and time, and that's this book, Time and Eternity. I think that this is perhaps my best book. I'm very proud of it. It takes a very difficult topic, namely God and the nature of time, and integrates these together and produces a theory of God and time, I think, that is very plausible. It's beautifully illustrated, footnotes at the bottom of each page for easy reference. So Time and Eternity is one of the books that I'm most proud of. And then again, I've had the opportunity to do collaborative books on God and time. Here is a book that was edited by my friend Greg Gansel called God and Time, 4 Views. And I picked the 4 participants to be in this book. It's Paul Helm, who holds to divine timelessness, Alan Paget, who holds that God exists prior to creation in a kind of non-metric time, myself, and then Nicholas Wolterstorff, who holds that God is simply omnitemporal throughout infinite time. And so, once again, you get the 4 different views in this book with a dialogue between these 4 thinkers.
Let's move on to the next subject.
The next area then that I tackled after spending 11 years on God and time was divine aseity. Aseity is the property of God's self-existence. That is to say that God and God alone is an uncreated reality. Everything other than God that exists is created. And this view is challenged by a philosophy called Platonism, which holds that in addition to God, there are uncreated abstract objects, things like numbers, sets, and other mathematical entities, propositions, properties, possible worlds, even things like literary compositions and musical scores are thought to be abstract objects by some. Fictional characters are thought by some to be abstract objects. And this seemed to me to be a dagger in the heart of Christian theism. I first encountered this objection in 1982 when I was at a conference of the Society of Christian Philosophers in Milwaukee and heard Thomas Morris from the University of Notre Dame lecture on what he called absolute creation, where he laid out this objection to God's self-existence and aseity from the existence of abstract objects. And I thought, this is the most powerful objection to theism I've ever heard, far more powerful than the problem of evil. And I did not know how to answer it. To compound problems, Morris's own solution seemed to be viciously circular, and almost no one was persuaded by it. And so this was an unresolved issue in my mind for decades, really. And finally, after finishing my work on divine eternity, I decided it was time to take this off the shelf and to tackle it. And so, Cameron, I spent the next 13 years studying divine aseity and the challenge of Platonism until I could come to rest on this issue. And out of that flowed these 2 books. First, God and Abstract Objects. This is the scholarly level version, about 500 pages long, defending God's unique status as the sole uncreated reality, and defending an anti-realist view of abstract objects, that to hold that abstract objects simply do not exist. I had the opportunity to distill this to a popular level form, or semi-popular, when I was invited to give the Cadbury lectures at my alma mater, the University of Birmingham. And so Oxford University Press published those lectures as God Over All, which was published in 2016. So this would be the version for someone who is not a professional philosopher, but is interested in divine aseity and the challenge of Platonism.
Are those the only two books that came out of your study?
Yes. Now I am currently doing a debate book with Peter Van Inwagen for Routledge called Are There Numbers? And this will be our debate on this subject. Van Inwagen is a prominent Platonist, and I'm an anti-realist. And so I will be doing this book with him. But so far, these are the only two books that have come out of that study because it's fairly recent. The one was just published in 2017.
Have you already started the debate with him, or is this something that you're planning to do?
Yes. Interestingly enough, at the American Philosophical Association 2 years ago in New York, a session was held on God Over All and featured Peter Van Inwagen, a Platonist, and Greg Welty, who is a divine conceptualist who believes that numbers and sets and properties are thoughts in the mind of God. And so we had the opportunity in that session to go at it. And Tyron Goldschmidt, who is a philosopher, saw it and invited Van Inwagen and me to participate in this book in a series called Little Debates on Big Subjects for Routledge. And so that was how that came about. And I have already begun to write that debate book, yes.
Do you have any personal anecdotes about Peter Van Inwagen that might interest our listeners?
Well, I don't think he would mind if I shared that he, like I, has restless leg syndrome. So when he tries to sleep at night, he has great difficulty in getting to rest and sleeping because his legs are restless. They kick about. And he told me one time when he was at a conference in Spain, he had to actually get up in the middle of the night and just walk about the town trying to walk this off because it was so intolerable. He has it much worse than I do.
Oh my goodness. All right, well, let's move on to the next series of books.
Well, the last thing that I have published is my work on the atonement of Christ. This is in preparation for my writing of philosophical systematic theology, my next project. I knew there were certain areas in systematic theology where I was weak. One of these areas was the atonement. And I had waited for years for other Christian philosophers to step up to the plate and to offer a robust defense of a Reformation view of Christ's atoning death. And no one has done so. And so I realized I was going to have to tackle it myself. And so that was what I did. I spent about 2 years working on the subject of the atonement. Out of that came this little book called The Atonement, which is published by Cambridge University Press. It's not really a popular level book, but it is a very short book, only around 100 pages long. And in July, Baylor University Press will be releasing this larger and more expansive treatment of the atonement called Atonement and the Death of Christ. And as you can see from the notice on the front, this is a sample copy, not for sale, that was sent to me by the publisher in advance to scrutinize for errors and so forth. But that will be out in July, and so I'm really looking forward to seeing this work on the atonement finally see the light of day.
Wow, that looks really cool. You said in July it comes out?
Yes.
All right. What do you have next? Do you have any others to?
Well, the only other thing that I brought with me today to mention would be books that are not in this series of studies of the attributes of God, but nevertheless have been very significant books for me. And the first one would be Reasonable Faith, which has become my signature book. In a way, it gave the name to the ministry that we now direct, called Reasonable Faith, our web-based ministry at reasonablefaith.org. And
what was the original name of that one?
Apologetics and Introduction. It was
Why the name change?
Well, partly because it was a different publisher. The Apologetics and Introduction went out of print, and I revised it and wanted to bring it back into print. And so the publisher gave it a new name. Now, the funny thing was that I wanted to call it Faith on the Offensive, in the idea that this is a positive case for the Christian faith. But I think they didn't like this word offensive because it has a double entendre to it. And so they said, let's call it Reasonable Faith. And I didn't like that. To me, that was about as exciting as cold oatmeal. But what I didn't realize is that the name Reasonable Faith is very controversial among secularists. The idea that there could be reasonable faith is almost like an oxymoron. And so it's turned out to be a really great title and a great name for the ministry.
And you're on the third edition of this book, is that correct?
Yes, the one I showed you here is the third edition, the most recent.
Yeah. Well, so what's the next book?
The next one and last that I brought would be the popular level version of Reasonable Faith, and this is called On Guard. On Guard is a sort of primer for beginners in apologetics, someone who has no background. And what this is a kind of manual for the defense of the faith. It gives you about 4 arguments for God's existence, and then it gives answers to the principal atheistic objections, such as the problem of evil, and then a defense of the radical self-understanding and personal claims of Jesus of Nazareth, his resurrection from the dead, and the uniqueness of Christ as the means of salvation. So On Guard is a wonderful book for lay people who haven't studied apologetics before, but who would like to equip themselves to be able to answer objections from unbelievers and to positively commend their faith to unbelievers.
Are there any books that you'd like to mention, like an honorable mention, any books that you've edited?
Yes, I would think one of the most important would be the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, which I and J.P. Moreland edited. Our goal in this book was to pick the absolutely top scholars on these different arguments for God's existence. For example, Alexander Pruss on the contingency argument, I and James Sinclair on the Kalam cosmological argument, Robin Collins on the fine-tuning argument, J.P. Moreland on the argument from mind, Lydia and Tim McGrew on the evidence for the resurrection. And then to give these scholars unlimited pages to develop their argument, not just a little 20-page, 30-page article, but an 80-page, 100-page article in the Blackwell Companion. And so this is a volume that is really without parallel in the literature because it gives top experts the space and freedom to develop their argument as fully as they wish. And it is really a tour de force.
Let me see if we can actually pinpoint that one. There it is. It's right beneath your hand. It's in the middle column here. You can't see the picture, but it's on the live stream here. You can actually see it says Natural Theology. So it's a pretty considerable, sizable book.
Yes, it's big tome.
Yeah, it's great, and it has a lot of really great articles. I mean, the one from Robin Collins is so good on the fine-tuning art. It is incredible.
Brilliant. I am so frustrated with Robin because I think he's been working on this book for 20 years, I think, called The Well-Tempered Universe. The title comes from a term used for tuning pianos. When a piano is finely tuned by a piano tuner, it's called tempered. And so his title that he has picked is The Well-Tempered Universe. And it's grown now to 2 volumes in manuscript, but he's not gotten around to publishing it yet. And I'm afraid that by the time he finally publishes it, I'm going to be too old to enjoy and use it. So I really want Robin to get on the ball here and get this thing published. But in the meantime, his published articles are just terrific on fine-tuning. There's no one better.
Well, I think it'd be we should definitely mention your co-written book with J.P. Moreland, Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview as well.
Yes, I think that is worth mentioning. J.P. and I wrote this introduction to Christian philosophy, and J.P. wrote the larger part of the book. I wrote the chapters on philosophy of religion, on philosophy of space and time, on the use of logic and reasoning, and it is a really terrific book for undergraduates or graduates who are needing an introduction to the broad range of philosophy, whether epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, philosophy of science, philosophy of religion, and so forth.
Are there any articles that you've written that are of note that listeners might be interested in searching out, maybe picking up and reading for themselves? Any that stick out in your mind?
You've caught me off balance there, Cameron. Usually the articles that I publish in professional journals will be excerpted or adapted from the books. And so a person wouldn't need to read the articles if he's read and digested the books.
Ah, okay. All right. Well, do you have any time to take some questions from
Certainly.
our audience?
Yes.
Just for a few minutes. We have one on the historical atom. Is that okay?
Yeah, I didn't mention that. Let me just say that for the last 2 years, as part of this project of writing a systematic philosophical theology, I needed to bone up in the area of theological anthropology as well. I just had not come to any settled views on the historical atom and the compatibility of the historical atom with contemporary science. And so I have just finished a 2-year study of the topic of the historical atom and have submitted that manuscript now to Baylor University Press, and it's under review.
Yeah, so that is very, very recent news that you've finished your study on the historical Adam and Eve. As
Yes.
of how recent was that? Like a week ago?
Last week.
Wow.
It's due to the
Wow, that's really cool.
quarantine.
Oh,
Because
well, that's good.
I've got all this time to spend morning till evening writing and studying.
All right. Well, we have a super chat from David LaRosa. He says, Dr. Craig, do you think Neanderthals would thrive in the 21st century, given the string evidence versus opinions that skull shape is critical for development of cognitive faculties modern humans possess, making them bearers of the highly coveted Imago Dei?
It's not the skull shape that is important. It is the skull or cranial capacity. What size brain would it permit? And here, the cranial capacity of Neanderthals actually exceeds that of modern Homo sapiens. In fact, the cranial capacity of Homo sapiens has actually been decreasing over the last 10,000 years, believe it or not. So, would they flourish if they were transported by time machine into our day and age? Yes, they would. Joshua Swamidass, who has been on the program here with me before, who is a computational biologist, has emphasized to me that even people who are taken out of very primitive cultures, like Stone Age cultures, and placed into a modern society, immediately learn to adapt to it, to get along, and to function. A great example of this would be when the colonists came from Europe to the United States, and they confronted American Indians who were living in a Stone Age culture. They hadn't invented smelting of metals. They were still using arrowheads and tomahawks and things of that sort. This was a Stone Age culture. And yet, Squanto, one of the Indians who met with the Pilgrims, was able to return to England with them, where he was employed as a butler for many years and got along just fine in English society before he expressed a desire to return to his own people. So here's a man who was plucked up out of a Stone Age culture, transported into 18th century Europe, the Europe of Newton's Principia Mathematica, of Bach's concertos, of the cathedrals and great architecture, and he got along just fine. So yes, I think that Neanderthals would just do fine in our society today.
We have another question from Anthony Rowden. Thank you for your super chat, Anthony. He says, Dr. Craig, what tips would you give for people hoping to write their own books in the future?
Wow. I guess it would depend on what type of book you want to write. If you, like me, want to write academic books, then I think you've got to invest a good deal of study. You need to get an advanced degree and to understand the literature of scholarship and how to interact with it. On the other hand, if you just want to write popular level books, then I would say that probably what you need to do is get lots of personal experiences so that you can relate personal anecdotes that others will find entertaining and interesting and will inspire or encourage them. And so get involved in activities that would give you lots of personal experiences to draw upon.
We have another super chat from Axapir. It says, how do you keep a childlike faith in Jesus with all the theology and philosophy acquisition over a lifetime?
Well, I like to distinguish between what I call a childlike faith and a childish faith. A childlike faith is a wholehearted trust and repose in God as your heavenly Father. And this is a kind of faith that Jesus commends to us. But a childish faith is an unreflective, immature faith. And the Bible does not commend that kind of faith to us. In 1 Corinthians 14, Paul says to the Corinthians, do not be children in your thinking. Be babes in evil, but in thinking, be mature. And so I try to have an intelligent faith, a reflective faith, intellectually, but at the same time, I try to maintain my devotional life, my church life, and other personal disciplines that will enable me to have this wholehearted trust and repose in God as my heavenly Father.
Okay, we have another question, and I just scrolled past it, but here we go. All right, Cranman Photo Cinema, he's our videographer. He says, Dr. Craig, why are events beginning to exist excluded in the Kalam? Fluctuations and libertarian free will choices aren't uncaused, so why wouldn't premise 1 also apply to events?
Well, we don't need to make it apply to events. So long as it applies to things, it means that the universe, which came into being, had a beginning, had to have a transcendent cause. So there's no need to claim too much. And this,
it's a more modest premise.
Yeah, it's a more modest premise. I think it's more intuitively obvious, too. I mean, good night. Nobody thinks that a horse could just materialize out of nothing in this room right now, or that an Eskimo village or a gasoline station could just pop into being. So while people might give a run for its money to the idea of an uncaused event, the idea of things coming into being uncaused, I think is just absurd. And this will then enable you just to avoid altogether questions about whether quantum mechanical events are uncaused. Is quantum indeterminacy real or merely epistemic? It avoids the question about the cause of free choices and so forth. So it's a more modest premise and I think more intuitively obvious.
Okay, another question from Guarded Acumen. He says, what happened to his books on special relativity?
Oh, well, I just didn't mention them. I haven't mentioned all 40 here today, but I have 2 books that also came out of this work on God and time. And one of them is, how does it go? It's something like Metaphysics and the Theory of Relativity. And this is a philosophical reflection upon special and general relativity theory. And then Quentin Smith and I edited together another volume of collected essays called Einstein and I think the Theory of Relativity, or Einstein and Absolute Time, or something like that. And this was for the centenary of the special theory of relativity, which Einstein published in 1905. This book was done around 2005 and is a series of essays by people who hold to what's called a neo-Lorentzian theory of special relativity, which Smith and I both hold to. That is to say, it holds that there actually are relations of absolute simultaneity and absolute length, and so forth, even though our physical measures of time and length are relative to the motion of observers.
All right, we have a question from Ontario Woods. He says, is the belief in the divinity of Christ necessary for salvation?
I think so, or I would say at least this much, that it cannot be denied. I imagine that certain people, like the thief on the cross, had no explicit belief in the divinity of Christ, but he trusted in Jesus. He said, remember me when you come into your kingdom. He believed that Jesus was the Messiah, even in his dying moment. And while he may not have had an explicit belief in the divinity of Christ, he didn't deny it. And so I think that would be key. Also think of people who have never heard of Christ, but who come to know God by their response to natural or general revelation alone. Or people in the Old Testament. I guess that's the most obvious example. People in the Old Testament are saved, and they have no explicit belief in the divinity of Christ. Abraham didn't have any belief in Christ's divinity, or Moses, and yet they clearly are part of the kingdom of God. So I think we can point to a number of examples of people who lack such an explicit belief, but they do not deny it. They respond in an appropriate way to the revelation that God has given to them.
Super chat from Benjamin Carlson. Thank you for that. He says, Dr. Craig, which non-academic book has influenced you the most? That might be a tough one.
Yeah. Well, would you call Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov a non-academic book? I don't know.
I think so.
It's one of the greatest works of literature. I love Russian literature, and Dostoevsky is the greatest in my opinion. So his book, The Brothers Karamazov, explains the absurdity of life and the moral nihilism that results from a denial of the existence of God, and illustrates its corrupting effects upon the human personality and society so powerfully. So I suppose I would point to that book.
I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. So this one from Maverick Christian. He says, what advice would you impart to a Christian philosophy student, including one that works full-time and goes to school part-time?
Well, I would say make sure you get well grounded in logic. Take some courses in introductory, sentential, or symbolic logic, and then make sure you get some modal logic under your belt as well. There's a chapter covering this in Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. So I think that's really essential. That is to the philosopher what Greek is to the New Testament scholar. So that would be my main advice. I'd also recommended reading Frederick Copleston's 9-volume History of Philosophy and taking notes on it. That will give you a compendium of notes on the whole history of Western philosophy that will acquaint you with the principal figures of Western thought and will serve you very well into the future. And then you might look at Moreland and my book, Philosophical Foundations, for an introduction to doing philosophy from a Christian point of view.
I was talking with an atheist a while back, and he was telling me, he's a friend of mine, he was telling me that he doesn't stay away from reading introductory books, even as someone has some experience in the field, because you can always learn new things, maybe even just how to say something in a better way, summarize some argument from someone else. So don't push off, even if you're someone who has experience, don't push away introductory books just because it's an introduction, something you might already be familiar with. They might put something away that is more succinct, more beautiful, and more persuasive, perhaps. So don't push away introductory books, even if you've got some background. All right, last question from, this is another one from our videographer. He says, Dr. Craig, would you be willing to do a show with Cameron that's just a Q&A on all of your work?
Oh, certainly. I would enjoy that. I've enjoyed my interviews with Cameron very much, and I'm so appreciative of getting them out there on the YouTube so that people worldwide can access these. So certainly I would. Awesome.
All right. Well, we can work on that in the background. Well, I appreciate you coming on. It's been a great video interview today, and so yeah, just appreciate all of your work and everything that you've done. I'm sure that people watching, they'd all like to thank you personally. Most of the people that are watching this, at least. But so I appreciate you coming on.
Oh, certainly, Cameron, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to share a little bit about my work.
Great. All right. Well, I'm just going to talk to the audience for a second. So if you guys have appreciated this video and you appreciate the work that I'm doing here, if you want to support me, you can go to patreon.com/capturingchristianity. You can support our ministry for however much you'd like a month, but that's the way that we keep the doors open, so to speak. We don't have any physical doors, but it does keep my 2 young kids fed and keeps this ministry going. So if you want to support patreon.com/capturingchristianity, that's the way to do that. It's also linked in the description of the video. I also mentioned that I'm going to have a linked comment. You may have missed the beginning of this video when I said this, but I'm going to have a pinned comment, of all of the books that Dr. Craig mentioned in this interview today. So if you want to see any of the books and get a direct link to those, just search for that comment. It's going to take me maybe a day or so to actually compile those. So if you're watching this live right now, it's not there, but in a couple days after the live stream, it will be there. So I appreciate you guys watching, and we'll see you later.